This is after the headlines. I'm Sarzah. Over the past several years, madrasa education has repeatedly appeared in Bangladeshi news. These discussions have emerged from concerns about student safety and institutional accountability. Public debate has focused on curriculum reform, graduate student employability, the role of religious education in a modern economy, and the rapid growth of Qaumi and Alia madrasa enrollment. Recent cases involving allegations of abuse against students have once again raised difficult questions about oversight and student well-being. When discussions about madrasa education comes up in Bangladesh, they often generate very strong reactions. For some, the madrasa represents a place of faith, discipline, and moral formation. For others, it raises questions about religious education in a rapidly changing world. And despite these strong opinions, many people have very little direct familiarity with how contemporary madrasa education in Bangladesh fits into the broader history of Islamic learning. Historically, institutions of Islamic learning were more than just places of religious instruction. They were centers of knowledge production that nurtured jurists, theologians, historians, philosophers, physicians, scientists, and statesmen. At the heart of this tradition was a shared pursuit of questions that remains relevant today. What is knowledge for? What kind of human being should education cultivate? How should societies balance reason, faith, ethics, and public life? Different scholars approached these questions from different angles. Al-Ghazali reflected on the relationship between knowledge and character. Ibn Khaldun examined the role of learning in shaping civilizations. Ibn Sina crossed the boundaries of medicine, philosophy, and theology with remarkable ease. Ibn Kathir devoted himself to the careful transmission and interpretation of knowledge, while scholars like Ibn Arabi explored its spiritual and transformative dimensions. These are only a handful of figures within a much larger intellectual tradition, but together they illustrate an important point. Islamic scholarship was never static. It evolved through debate, disagreement, and continual engagement with new intellectual, social, and political realities. Throughout Islamic history, there were debates over reason and revelation, philosophy and theology, tradition and reform, preservation and innovation, questions about what should be taught, who should teach it, and how knowledge should be transmitted. They have always been contested. Even the transmission of knowledge itself has been fraught with tension. The debates surrounding, for example, with the adoption of printing press in parts of the Ottoman Empire, remind us that Muslim societies, like all societies, have grappled with the opportunities and anxieties that accompany new technologies. Concerns about authority, authenticity, and preservation of knowledge shaped those debates then, much as questions surrounding artificial intelligence and digital learning shape educational discussions today. Islamic education in South Asia is a critical case in point, though. Colonial rule transformed educational institutions across the region, while some scholars sought to preserve inherited traditions through Deobandi institutions. Others pursued different visions of religious authority, spirituality, and community life. Alongside these developments, emerged new forms of schooling, curricula, debates about relationship between religion, modernity, and public life. And Bangladesh inherited many of these historical currents. Today, its educational landscape includes Alia madrasas, Qaumi madrasas, private Islamic institutions, mainstream schools, universities, and increasingly digital forms of learning. To help us think through these critical questions, I'm joined by Mushfiqur Rahman. Mushfiq is a researcher and writer whose educational journey spans several traditions of Islamic education in Bangladesh. He studied at Tanzimul Ummah and Tamirul Millat Madrasa. He serves as Foreign Affairs Secretary at the Islamic Research Institute in Bangladesh, and he is also currently an Erasmus scholar in Poland. In today's conversation, we hope to explore the history of madrasa education, the intellectual traditions that shaped it, the challenges and opportunities facing Islamic scholarship today, and what the future of Islamic education might look like in Bangladesh and beyond. Mushfiq, thank you so much for joining us.
Assalamu alaikum, Sajaku. Thank you very much for having me here. And thank you very much for choosing this very timely topic. And I think we'll be discussing academically this topic throughout our discussion, inshallah.
Absolutely. Mushfiq, to start with, I want to get a sense of how Bangladeshis in general perceive madrasa education. Many Bangladeshis have very strong opinions when it comes to madrasa education, but have very little experience with it. How would you explain the madrasa tradition and its role in Bangladeshi society if I were to ask you to take a macro perspective?
Well, I believe that when we trying to understand the madrasa education system in Bangladesh, we often make a fundamental mistake. We tend to view the madrasa education system merely as an educational institution, whereas historically it has been a civilizational institution. And throughout the history of Islamic civilization, we see that madrasa were never simply placed for teaching religious knowledge. Rather, they served as a center of knowledge production, moral formation, leadership development, and the preservation of civilizational continuity, for example. So, in the great intellectual center of Muslim world, for example, Baghdad, Nishapur, Damascus, Cairo, Cordoba, and even Delhi, madrasas functioned as integral parts of the broader, knowledge civilization.
Mhm.
So, in the context of Bangladesh, the madrasa is not merely the educational systems. It is deeply connected with the rural society, religious culture, social leadership, and the moral life of the people. And however, I believe another important dimension must be added here, or in this contemporary discussion, that today we believe that we are living in some of the situation where many thinkers describe as a post-truth world, or a post-normal world, right? Or age of meaning crisis. This is very important to understand the whole discussion of ours. So they acquire knowledge, but not wisdom, not hikmah. They gain power,
Mhm.
but lost their sense of purpose. In such a context, the fundamental role of the madrasa should be to reconnect human beings with their ultimate reality. For example, who is the human being? Why were human beings created? What is the purpose of life? What is the goal of human civilization? Historically, madrasa have been, entrusted with answering these of the fundamental questions. But
Right.
at the same time, however, we must honestly acknowledge this very thing that contemporary madrasa have not fully maintained this of historical rule. Once madrasa produced knowledge, but today, in many cases, they primarily preserve knowledge. Once madrasa helped build civilization, but today we can see that many of them are engaged in defending themselves against the crisis of the civilization. So yes, recognizing this reality is essential
Mhm.
if we are move forward constructively. Yeah.
Mushfiq, I think you have very aptly touched upon how the role of madrasa has evolved, particularly in the Bangladeshi context. And I think that it's really important how you sort of pinpointed the deprioritization of hikmah, uh, character building. When I look at Islamic pedagogy, that takes up a very central scope, but that is
Mhm.
very absent, almost
Mhm.
extant in our madrasa education. I want to backtrack a little bit and ask you about the rural mosaic that you mentioned about how the rural sphere plays a really important role in madrasa education and the audience of madrasa education and knowledge production. Could you zoom in a bit on what's the role of madrasa in rural society? And you could also, speak to your own experience.
Today's society, especially in the rural society, the madrasa education is become the mandatory something. For example, those who are not being able to get with, for example, school or any kind of, another educational systems, they are getting into the madrasa education system. This is the misconception, I think, one of a very misconception. And the very word, if I would like to, discuss about from my own experiences, the misconception about madrasa education is, there are two opposing misconception in madrasa education in our society, for today's society. For example, one believe that those who have not to do nothing, they should go for madrasa. And if I mean, elaborate this thing, for example, one group views madrasa as a symbol of backwardness, blind, conformity, or rote learning. And another group believes, that there are no problems within the madrasa education at all, in sense of all the criticism. And this, all the criticism is the part of, conspiracy. So in my view, as I have pursued madrasa for 12 years, so in my view, both position capture only part of the reality.
Yeah.
Those who see madrasa merely as symbols of the darkness, or for example, for the rural people, they do an injustice to the history. And for much of Islamic civilization, for example, madrasa were the primary center of the intellectual production.
Mhm.
The intellectual legacies of, for example, Ibn Sina, Imam al-Ghazali, Fakhruddin Razi, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Khaldun even didn't emerge from a vacuum, right?
Mm.
So on the other hand, those who have denied the existence of the crisis within the madrasa education are equally, detached from the reality.
Yeah.
I can say from my experience, it is evident that Muslim world's knowledge production system has weakened, and universities have largely come under the influence of the Western epistemological frameworks. So many madrasa, meanwhile, have limited themselves to preserving tradition rather than actively contributing to the society and to the intellectual development. As a result, a division within knowledge has emerged nowadays. And I believe the most overlooked aspect of the madrasa is that it is not merely an educational system, it is an epistemological framework. And
Mm.
at this core, the madrasa, represent an effort to establish a relationship between human beings, creation, knowledge, and revelation. So yeah, contemporary discussion often overlook this deeper dimension.
Yeah. Mushfiq, I think one of the key points that you reiterated over the course of our brief conversation now is about preservation, how madrasa's role as a producer of knowledge has taken a backseat, and it's mostly about preserving. I'm curious about what kind of knowledge are our contemporary madrasas trying to preserve, and that actually brings me to the Islamic scholarship research and intellectual traditions part. Um, if you could speak a little bit about, what areas of Islamic thought, history, or contemporary Muslim life, what type of knowledge are these madrasas trying to preserve?
To answer this question, we must look back to the history, Abu. The current state of Muslim education, especially in South Asia, is not the result of the sudden development. Rather, it is the outcome, or it is the, let's say, result of the last 2 centuries of the historical, transformation. For example, British colonialism played a particularly significant role in this process. So before colonial rule, Muslim societies possessed an integrated concept of knowledge. For example, fiqh, tafsir, kalam, philosophy, history, mathematics, and most importantly, astronomy were all understood as parts of single intellectual universe. But colonialism, however, fragmented the knowledge. Religion is placed one side, science is another side, madrasa is one side, university is another side. So in this sense, this division was, not merely institutional the time. It represented the epistemological framework. So over the past several decades, Bangladeshi madrasa have undergone significant changes.
Mhm.
English has been incorporated with their curriculum. Technology has been part of their educational experiences. Many students now pursue, like me, studies in international universities, and interest in research has increased. Yet, a fundamental, question remain: are we merely trying to adapt a modernity, or like are we seeking to, reconstruct the unity of knowledge in a new way? So in my view, this should be, center question guiding, future madrasa reform. For example, if I want to answer your specific question, and modern people possess more information than at any previous,
Mm.
point in the history, right? They
Absolutely.
yet they are also more, confused than ever before. For this reason, many describe our era as the post-truth age. And this is like in this such of environment, emotions often, outweigh truth, and narrative becomes more powerful than reality, and algorithms, exert what's say it, greater influence than genuine knowledge. And under such of circumstance, the task of Islamic scholarship is not merely to issue, legal ruling, or what's say it, not issue for fatwa.
Right.
Yeah, rather, rather it is to interpret human beings, society, and at the same time universe in a meaningful and coherent way. Imam Ghazali coherent, the same thing, and he confronted a crisis of knowledge in his own era, or on his own time. So he observed a growing, separation between knowledge and moral character. But today, crisis has, become more deeper. Our universities produce knowledge, but technology at the same time generate power, but neither necessarily generate meaning. This
Right.
is very important, and as a result, many people find themselves trapped in a state of let's say existential emptiness. So in such a situation, Islamic scholarship must help guide humanity to back toward ultimate reality, not merely through religious observance, but through knowledge, reflection, research, and wisdom, or hikmah. So in
Right.
his in such kind of regards, I'm particularly reminded of Ibn Khaldun. He taught us that the rise of fall of civilization can only be understood by examining society, politics, and economics, and at the same time culture together. Contemporary scholars must adapt, or madrasa students must adapt the same approach. They should not merely an interpreters of the past, but thinkers, capable of the engaging with the future, and they must reestablish the dialogue of between Taqween and Tanzil together.
And I think, the point that you brought up about Ibn Khaldun Mushfiq is a really key one over here, right? If you look at Khaldun's Muqaddimah, right? It's such a comprehensive bundle of knowledge, right? It looks at sociology, it looks at periphery, it looks at the core. Um, it actually also reminds me of Wallerstein's world systems analysis, right? He like really looked into the structures to develop theory of how we function. And I think that our intellectual tradition, the contemporary intellectual tradition, particularly in Bangladesh, um, it's very lethargic. So given your background in Islamic research, your engagement with Islamic knowledge production, how do you think that our religious scholars, our teachers, our imams, our religious advisors, how can they catch up with the needs of our times?
To answer this question, I want to emphasize one thing, that those who just you have like alluded, like Imam or Islamic scholars. So if I just want to separate them between two categories, for example, the preachers and the researcher, that is actually common question in our society. So I believe that one of the major cause of current intellectual crisis of Muslim world is that we often blur the distinction between research and research and dawah, or
Practitioner.
popular
Yep.
practitioner, and the popular religious preacher that we call wajin or was. So the purpose of dawah, is to inspire people, awaken their moral, consciousness, and invite them toward truth. And we need to understand the two categories. And the purpose of research, however, it is, to investigate and discover truth. While the ultimate goals of both may be the similar, their methods are, foundationally different. A preacher influences the hearts of the people, but a researcher like shapes their understanding. Today, Muslim societies are producing many speakers and many preachers, but comparatively few thinkers, researchers, and theorists, right? This is very harsh truth. As a result, we discuss the symptoms of our problems, but rarely analyze their underlying causes. For example, we often like talk about the moral crisis facing Muslim youth, yet only rarely do we examine deeper realities such as the post-truth society, consumer culture, digital capitalism, or meaning crisis. So when Al-Ghazali wrote Ihya Ulumuddin, he didn't like merely offer the moral exhortation, right? He analyzed the epistemic crisis of his time. Similarly, Ibn Khaldun didn't merely narrative history. He examined the laws and causal mechanism underlying historical, changes. So today we need to the same kind of research and same kind of thing, and we need to analyze or we need to fix our murabi or our alim into together. I mean, in this two part, and we need to we need scholar who not simply answer questions such as like what is halal and what is haram. We also need a scholar who asks the answer of the deeper question. For example, like how did human being arrive at his condition at in the first place? So in my view, the future of Islamic civilization depends on how quickly we can move from a culture of sermons of a culture of the research. Because a civilization cannot survive, through just speeches alone. A civilization endures through the production of knowledge. And I don't know, whether I'm answering your
Absolutely.
question
I
or not,
think that
but I
this is great, Mushfiq, and it just also made me think about how Dawa spaces are, they mirror social media in a sense that the
Mhm.
engagement that happens between the dawa provider and someone who takes the
Mhm.
dawa in the audience, right?
Mhm.
It's a very short term and uncritical engagement, right? It doesn't really inspire people to think. And I want to come back to that, and I want to ask you later on, how can we sort of bridge the gap between dawa providers and preachers and practitioners and researchers? Because it would be great if our imams and our preachers were also looking at the research that's happening. But for now, I want to zoom in on students in the madrasa education system. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that enrollment has gone up. So regardless of the current curriculum, if these young students are interested in developing very solid research skills in Islamic studies while engaging in contemporary academic scholarship, how do you think these young students can go about developing themselves as either practitioners or researchers?
Okay, that is very also timeable question, and I would be happy if I can answer it properly. You know, if I answer this question, we need to look toward the Reformation, right? Because the traditional thing has been over, I think, right now, and people or the students started thinking differently. So they are thinking about the reformation of their curriculum system. But here I believe that before discussing reform in madrasa education, we must first answer a fundamental question. For example, what exactly we are trying to reform: the curriculum, the administration, or the entire vision of the knowledge itself? This is, I think, important to know before. For example, in my view, the greatest crisis facing madrasa education or madrasa students is not a curriculum one. I think it is a vision crisis. Today, we often say that madrasa students are learning English, or it need more English. It need to incorporate sciences, like it need to provide technological education. All these are certainly necessary. Yes, I agree with that. But they are not. These are not the root of the problem, as far I can think. For example, the fundamental issue is that we have lost the unity of knowledge. And in the history of Islamic civilization, knowledge was never viewed in such a fragmented categories. Like madrasa students or madrasa education who can learn tafsir, fiqh, kalam, philosophy, and at the same time, he also it is mandatory to learn mathematics. It is mandatory to learn medicine. It is the ultimate part of the Islamic madrasa education. It should be. He should learn about astronomy, where all this are all regarded as the different means of understanding Allah's creation and his science and his truth, right? So colonialism fragmented knowledge. I already have said it. And religion was placed in one side, sciences another side, madrasa is one side, universities and another side. As a result, a deep separation emerged within knowledge itself. The most important task for madrasa students or madrasa reformation today should be to overcome this division, I think. And I call this is the integration of knowledge. So, for example, those who are learning traditional madrasa curriculum, they also have to learn more about it. That is not part of the madrasa education system right now. For example, we must cultivate scholars who understand the Quran while also understanding history, who study hadith while also understanding sociology, who master on fiqh while also engaging with the contemporary economics. Scholars who are not merely in corporates of these parts, like he cannot understand the society.
Right.
And scholars who are not merely interprets the past, but thinkers capable of shaping the future. So the another thing I should allude here, we must develop a research-oriented education or educational culture there in madrasa education. For example, today, most madrasas transmit knowledge, right? But produce very little new knowledge, right? We must rebuild our capacity of ijtihad. That is very important. And every age present a new question, right? And you have to answer of each of the questions that is newly arising in your ages. So every age requires fresh thinking to address those of the questions. So to me, the true meaning of madrasa education or madrasa reformation is not the destruction of the tradition, rather it is renewal or tajdid of the previous tradition or the previous reformation.
Mushfiq, one theme running through Islamic intellectual history is that the pursuit of knowledge carries responsibility. Questions of scholarship become questions of ethics, leadership, and public life. So, as we think about the future of Islamic education and research in Bangladesh, what areas of Islamic thought deserve greater scholarly attention, and what principles do you think should guide institutions responsible for producing, preserving, and transmitting Islamic knowledge?
In my view, um, um, at least 5 areas I should cover in this case. For example, first, Islamic epistemology. How do we acquire knowledge, for example? And what is the relationship between revelation, reason, experiences, and history? Since the advent of modernity, the Muslim world has struggled to provide satisfactory answer of these questions. So as a result, we have borrowed Western epistemological frameworks while failing to reconstruct our own conditions, our own foundations of knowledge. And the second thing is that should be added in the research works in the madrasa education right now is civilizational history. Because the education that is completely separated from its root, it won't be work anymore with its good essence or with its ruh. So that is particularly, I want to say it for the second time, that particularly the history of Bengali region for a long time, history of the Bengali region has been interpreted through the colonizational perspective or narrow national frameworks, right? So consequently, Bengali civilization experiences Islamic, intellectual tradition, Sufi heritage, and at the same time, social, institutions and connections with the wider Muslim world have not been adequately understood. So that's why it is need to incorporate with the education system of madrasa education. At the same time, the technology and the future humanity. Artificial intelligence is a very relevant topic today. At the same time, biotechnology, transhumanism, are not merely technological issues. Because they raise fundamental question about human nature, freedom, consequences, and morality. And at the same time, meaning crisis should be emphasized on the madrasa education system, because why are people increasingly experiences despair, or why are suicide rates rising? Why are consumerism unable to satisfy humans' existential crisis? This question should be addressed in the essence of the madrasa education. And the fifth thing is the relationship between knowledge and ethics. This is immensely important, and we have become technologically advanced today, yet not morally advanced. Why has this separation occurred? And at the same time, how can Islam offer solution of it? And in my view, as I were in Madrasa, this very fundamental questions are not reviewed, are not revised there. Because it is just in the form of lies with the tradition, lies with the Western epistemology, lies with the flow of it. But the ruh essence of it is completely disappeared there. So in this of sense, this is not only the cause of students or the curriculum. At the same time, there is a huge responsibility of the teacher who are incorporating with the students. Because when I was in madrasa, this type of ethical development, there is a number of teachers I have ever sit with their dars. They encourage us to flourish our inner, to evaluate a thing with its ruh. But there is all at the same time, unfortunately, there is another who don't have carry any kind of intellectuality or any kind of Islamic frameworks. Rather, they are educated from the Western epistemological frameworks, and they are implementing the same thing with the madrasa education. So this is the one of the crises, I think. And at the same time, I believe that the greatest crisis of knowledge production there today is not, of course, the technological. At the same time, the ethical. If I emphasize it more, we are producing knowledge there, but we are unable to answer a fundamental question. What is the purpose of knowledge? This is not be reviewed in madrasa. Modern civilization has given us the remarkable technologies, yes, but it has also given us nuclear weapons, right? And it has given us artificial intelligence, but it has also enabled surveillance state. So knowledge has increased, but wisdom or hikmah that is actually needed in madrasa education right now, hikmah has not.
Right.
So this is where the Islamic intellectual tradition remains highly relevant today. And in Islam, the purpose of knowledge is not merely the acquisition of power. We need to understand that knowledge is not power. Knowledge should not be compared with the power. It is purpose of know the reality, know the ultimate reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, establish the justice and the promote human flourishing. It should be included to the main essence with the madrasa education. And Imam Ghazali never regarded knowledge as something morally neutral. He connected knowledge to ethics. Likewise, within the Islamic civilization tradition, the responsibility of the scholar was not merely to provide information, but also offer the ethical and moral leadership. So I will conclude this question just alluding a few sentences. For example, today educational institution must to must to go for with some points. For example, firstly, commitment to truth. It is very necessary for inspiring students. And secondly, akhlaq, or the moral character or the ethics. Thirdly, accountability, human welfare, right? And very importantly, tawazun, that is basically balance and moderation. We can translate it. And yes, I believe these principles are even more important in the contemporary, post-truth age, and we live in a time when information can be easily manipulated. History can be easily rewritten, or the perception of reality can be shaped through the algorithm. So in such a situation, the responsibility of madrasa education or institution is not merely to produce skilled professionals, rather to cultivate individual who bear witness of truth, who bear the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or this thing. Yeah.
I think what you're talking about, Mushfiq, is, it touches upon critical literacy, right? Not only producing skilled professionals, but producing learners, right? Lifelong learners, so that they can, keep learning and implementing, these critical literacy skills. Previously, you had mentioned about the difference between the practitioner and the researcher, right? I'm really curious to get your thoughts on how we can bridge this gap. And when I think about the gap, I think about how our practitioners or preachers or our public-facing scholars may not necessarily critically examine research, right? Because the thing is that these are reservoirs, these are in many ways messengers of knowledge, right? For the mass audience. So how can we get dawah providers or practitioners to look at research? How can we motivate them or encourage them, or what kind of reform is necessary to bridge this gap between research and knowledge and practice?
There is a two category we can recognize our alim, right? One is those who are go and doing dawah work, for example, those who at the same time it is traditional works, and at the same time in every winter it is really common in Bangladesh that I mean peoples are gathered in one place and there is some preacher. They are doing their dialogue on deen, on based on halal, what is haram, this of thing. And at the same time, apart from this, we also need to grow some researcher. And I believe modern people, possess more information than at any previous point in the history. So they are already, known what is halal and what is haram for him, but they are not aware about the deeper thing of it. So I mean the past history or what had been done with some drama, I mean some stories is not enough for reviving the people's mind. It is really necessary to make them understand that what is our I mean responsibility for this post truth age, and at the same time in this environment, narratives become more powerful than reality. So we need to make some narrative over the reviving of our knowledge. So at the same time, as it is 21st century, there is many of like more works that is actually not enough for I mean doing just preaching. For example, those who are imam who also have to know the social coherence of that mosque. I mean, from where they belong to. For example, those who are imam and at the same time those who are teacher of like a primary level education madrasa, who also have to know about his people, those who are coming for this mosque or those who are coming for this days of madrasa. This is another very important thing to doing preaching, counting the people, those who are sitting in front of him. I want to more scrutinize one thing with that. We must first understand the greatest challenges of 21st century, and like some will say technological, some will say it is artificial intelligence issue, and other will point the globalization issue, right? So but I believe these are merely manifestation of deeper knowledge. So those who are preacher in our society, who have to know about all the point together. The real crisis is that human beings are increasingly losing their sense of identity. So they have to recognize that identity. They have to make the people aware about their purpose of life, about their meaning of life. It is really important, rather just telling them some history. History is also important, but the identifying the modern man problem is also another important and inseparable part of the reviving them. And today, I mean, a person may be highly advanced technologically while simultaneously suffering from a profound existential crisis. So this accounting this existential crisis, a preacher or those who are researcher who have to work for it. And for this reason, many contemporary thinkers describe our age as the era of meaning crisis. So why they are recognized in meaning crisis? So we have to work also for it. And I will be concluding within just few words that the foremost responsibility of today's at the same time madrasa education students, researcher, and preacher should be to address the crisis. We must cultivate students who are prepared not only for being employee, but also for being able to answering this of the question. We must understand who is human being, what are the source of the human dignity, what does freedom truly mean, what are the limits of the technology, and what is the foundation of morality. That should be the moral question for this time. So I believe future madrasa education students or the preacher or the researcher must learn to read two realms simultaneously. One side is like tanzil or the divine revelation, and other side is ta'ween or the creation of of reality. So if this two forms are reading can be integrated, we can cultivate a generation capable not only a religious or usual preacher, but also a leader, civilizational leadership. Yeah.
Absolutely. And Mushfiq, I think from what you said, I hear that our challenge with madrasa education or Islamic research and the gap between dawah provider and the researcher, it's two-pronged. The first is remaining authentic and genuine to the rigorous Islamic intellectual tradition, because the way we're operating is very ahistorical. Secondly, what I hear is that, confronting the crisis head on, which we are running away from. And I think the challenge remains, right? How can we equip madrasas to do that work, to remain authentic to the rich intellectual tradition, and at the same time, produce learners who can think critically, who can engage and integrate at a deeper level. We're towards the end of the segment, Mushfiq. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And to our listeners, thank you. If this conversation helped you see madrasa education through a different lens or prompted new questions or challenged old assumptions, then stay in the conversation. Until next time.